The horse did not kneel for kings, gold, or whips, but that morning, before every noble eye in Whitmore Hall, it lowered its head to the girl they had all laughed at. The winter auction had drawn half the county to the Duke of Whitmore's estate, though no one admitted they had come for the horses alone. They came for the spectacle. They came to see Alexander Whitmore, the coldest duke in New England, stand beneath the black iron arches of his riding court, while snow drifted softly beyond the glass roof and liveried servants carried silver trays through the breath-fogged air. They came to whisper about his wealth, his grief, his ruined tenderness, and most of all, about the black stallion no man could master. Midnight stood in the center of the stone ring like a storm-given flesh. His coat was dark as spilled ink, his mane wild, his eyes bright with something deeper than temper. 3 trainers had already tried that morning. One had stepped back pale and shaken, another had dropped the reins as though they burned his hands, and the third had bowed stiffly to the Duke before admitting, with great humiliation, that the animal would not be touched. Duke Alexander watched from the edge of the ring, dressed in a black coat cut with severe elegance, his gloved hands folded over the silver head of his cane. His gray eyes did not soften. They never did. Again, he said, and the single word struck the air like ice against glass. At the far side of the court, Clara Bennett paused with a wooden bucket in her hands. She had only meant to cross quietly from the pump to the stable door, but nothing about Clara was made to disappear completely, no matter how modestly she dressed. She was young, bright-eyed, and lovely in a way that seemed almost out of place among the cold stone and colder faces, with soft brown curls escaping beneath her wool cap and cheeks warmed by the winter air. There was a liveliness in her, a quick silver spark, though she had learned to hide it when the gentry passed too near. Her smile came easily to frightened children, tired maids, and restless animals, but never to those who mistook kindness for weakness. Lady Victoria Ashford saw her first. The lady stood beside the railing in pale blue velvet, perfect as a painted porcelain doll and twice as sharp. Her gaze traveled over Clara's worn brown dress, her damp sleeves, the splash of mud on one boot. "How touching," Victoria said loudly enough for the nearby guests to hear. "Perhaps the stable mouse would like to try. She seems to have opinions about everything with 4 legs." A ripple of laughter moved through the court. Clara's fingers tightened on the bucket handle, but she did not lower her head. Not fully. She had been dismissed in finer rooms than this, and by voices far crueler than Lady Victoria's. Still, shame had a way of finding the smallest opening in a heart and pressing there. Mr. Harlan Pierce, the head groom, gave her a warning look. "Back to the stalls, Miss Bennet." But Victoria lifted her fan. "No, let her come. If the beast throws her dignity into the snow, there will be very little lost." More laughter. Clara felt heat rise beneath her skin. She wanted to answer. She wanted to say that a frightened animal was not a beast, that terror often wore the mask of fury because the world had never offered it another costume. Instead, she set the bucket down with careful hands and stepped toward the ring. The court quieted, not out of respect, but anticipation. A pretty servant girl approaching the Duke's untamable stallion was not courage to them. It was entertainment. Alexander's gaze fixed on her at last. "Stop." Clara stopped, but she did not retreat. The Duke's voice was low, controlled, and without warmth. "That horse is dangerous." "No, Your Grace," Clara said, her voice clear despite the tremor in her chest. "He is afraid." A silence followed, delicate and terrible. Midnight tossed his head, the silver fittings of his bridle flashing in the pale light. His hooves struck the stone once, twice, echoing like a warning bell. The guests drew back. Clara did not. She took one slow step forward, then another, her breath white in the cold air. "Easy," she whispered, not as a command, but as a promise. "No one is asking you to be brave all at once." Alexander's hand tightened around his cane. For the first time that morning, something disturbed the stillness of his face. Midnight turned sharply toward Clara. A woman gasped. The stallion moved with sudden force, black mane sweeping over his neck, and every person in the court seemed to inhale at once. Clara stood where she was, small before him, mud at her hem, light in her eyes, one hand slowly rising with nothing in it. "No whip, no rope, no demand. You are not wicked," she whispered. You are only tired of being hurt. The stallion stopped so close that his breath stirred the loose curls beside her cheek. Clara did not touch him. She waited. The whole court waited with her. Then Midnight lowered his great black head until his nose hovered near her open palm, and the laughter died, as if the winter itself had swallowed it. Lady Victoria's fan froze midair. Mr. Pierce went pale. Duke Alexander Whitmore stared at the girl everyone had dismissed, and in the shadowed hollow of his chest, behind years of locked doors and unsaid grief, something long silent gave a single, painful beat. The silence after Midnight lowered his head was more unsettling than the laughter had been. Clara felt it press against her from every side, heavy with disbelief, suspicion, and the sharp discomfort of people who had just witnessed the world refuse to obey its proper order. Her hand remained open beneath the stallion's warm breath. She did not dare move too quickly. She knew animals, especially wounded ones, remembered every sudden motion. "Good boy," she whispered, barely loud enough for herself to hear. Midnight's ears flicked forward. His dark eye, wide and glossy as a winter pond, watched her with a kind of desperate attention that tightened Clara's throat. Behind the railing, a gentleman cleared his voice as though trying to rescue the room from its own astonishment. Lady Victoria snapped her fan shut. The sound cracked through the court. Midnight lifted his head at once, muscles tensing beneath his shining coat. Clara turned slightly, not toward Victoria, but toward the horse. "It is nothing," she murmured. "Only noise." Duke Alexander stepped into the ring then. The crowd parted before him without being asked. His black boots crossed the pale stone, each step measured, each movement carrying the effortless command of a man born to be obeyed. Clara felt his presence before he reached her, colder than the air, sharper than the silver buckles on Midnight's bridle. "Miss Bennet," he said. Her name in his voice sounded unfamiliar, almost too important. Clara lowered her hand and gave a small curtsy. "Your Grace." "How did you do that?" She glanced at Midnight. "I did not do anything to him." "That is not an answer." "It is the only honest one." A murmur moved through the guests. No servant girl spoke to a duke with such steadiness, not unless she was foolish, proud, or desperate. Clara was perhaps a little of all three, though she wore it with quiet grace. Her face remained composed, but her heart beat so hard she could feel it beneath the worn fabric of her bodice. Alexander studied her as if she were a locked room, and he had misplaced the key. He had expected fear. He had expected flattery. He had expected some common trick learned in a country stable. Instead, she stood before him with wind-touched curls, mud on her hem, and eyes bright enough to seem almost defiant, though there was nothing rude in them. Only life. That was what unsettled him. Whitmore Hall had forgotten what life looked like when it was not polished, posed, or arranged for display. "You work in my stables," he said. "Yes, Your Grace." "For how long?" 3 months. "And no one thought to mention you had a gift with horses?" Mr. Pierce stepped forward quickly, his face tight with embarrassment. "Your Grace, the girl is useful enough with brushing and water pails, but she has no formal training." This was luck, nothing more. Clara's mouth softened, not quite a smile. Luck was what people called skill when it belonged to someone poor. She said nothing. She did not have the luxury of correcting men who could dismiss her before supper. Duke Alexander looked from Pierce to Clara, and something cool passed behind his eyes. Luck does not stand still when 1,200 pounds of muscle charges toward it. Lady Victoria let out a delicate laugh. "Surely you are not suggesting the girl be praised for standing in the wrong place at the right time. Servants are often where they should not be." Clara's cheeks warmed, but she kept her gaze on the stone floor. She thought of the folded notice in her apron pocket, the one from the boarding house in town where her younger brother, Samuel, lay coughing through the cold nights. 2 weeks behind. Payment required by Friday. Lose the position, lose the room. Lose the room, lose the doctor. Pride was a beautiful thing, but medicine cost real money. "I apologize for disrupting the auction," Clara said. "It will not happen again." She turned to leave. Midnight moved with her. Not far, only 1 step, but it was enough. The great stallion's head followed the line of her shoulder, and the court seemed to breathe in again. Alexander saw it. So did every guest. Clara stopped, startled by the soft scrape of hoof against stone. For the first time since entering the ring, her lively composure cracked, and a small, tender smile touched her face. Not triumphant, Not proud, just kind. It struck Alexander with unreasonable force. He had seen women smile for applause, for diamonds, for proposals, for victory. He had not seen someone smile because a frightened creature had chosen to trust her. "Miss Bennet," he said. She turned back. Snowlight from the glass ceiling rested on her hair, catching the brown curls with threads of gold. "You will not return to water pails." Mr. Pierce stiffened. Lady Victoria's eyes narrowed. Clara's breath caught. "Your Grace." Alexander looked at Midnight, then at her. "Until I say otherwise, you will tend to this horse personally. No one else is to handle him without your instruction." The words landed harder than any compliment could have. Clara felt the court shift around her, admiration in some faces, resentment in others, and danger in the silence of those who had enjoyed seeing her small. She curtsied because she had to, but when she rose, her eyes met the Duke's for one brief second. "As you wish, Your Grace." Alexander should have turned away then. He should have returned to the auction, to the guests, to the life built from duty and stone. Instead, he watched Clara Bennet walk beside Midnight toward the shadowed stable doors, the black stallion. Following her, as though the whole world had narrowed to the sound of her quiet voice. By dusk, the auction guests had gone, leaving Whitmore Hall wrapped in a silence that felt larger than the estate itself. The glass roof of the riding court had turned dark with evening, and beyond it, snow continued to fall over the frozen fields in soft, soundless layers. Clara Bennet stood inside Midnight's stall with a lantern hanging from a black iron hook and a brush in her hand, though she had spent more time speaking to the horse than grooming him. "There now," she said gently, drawing the brush along his neck in slow strokes. "No one is laughing at you anymore." Midnight flicked one ear toward her. His great body remained tense, but not wild. Not with her. That alone felt like a miracle too fragile to name. Clara smiled despite the ache in her feet and the sting of cold in her fingers. She had always been lively by nature, the sort of girl who could make a kitchen maid laugh during a storm or coax a barn cat from the rafters with half a biscuit and a cheerful scolding. But tonight, her brightness felt carefully folded away. Too much had changed in a single afternoon. A duke had spoken her name. A room full of nobles had stared at her as if she had stepped out of a fairy tale by mistake. And now the most dangerous horse in Massachusetts stood quietly beneath her hand. From outside the stall, a floorboard creaked. Midnight lifted his head. Clara turned and found Duke Alexander Whitmore standing in the stable aisle, his black coat dusted with snow, his face half lit by the lantern glow. He looked less like a man entering a stable than a shadow returning to the place that had made it. "Forgive the intrusion," he said, though nothing in his tone suggested he needed permission anywhere on his own estate. Clara curtsied quickly. "Your Grace, do not stop on my account." She hesitated, then resumed brushing Midnight's coat. The Duke remained just beyond the stall door. He did not reach for the horse. He did not even step closer. Clara noticed that at once. Men who feared horses often pretended otherwise. Alexander did not pretend. His stillness was too controlled, his gaze too fixed on the animal's dark flank, as if memories stood between them with a locked hand on his chest. "He belonged to someone else before me," Clara said softly. The Duke's eyes moved to her. The air seemed to sharpen. "Who told you that?" "No one had to. He listens for a voice that is gone." Alexander's jaw tightened. For several seconds, only the quiet brush strokes filled the stall. Then he said, "My brother, Thomas." The name came out colder than the winter air, but beneath it Clara heard the break. Midnight was his favorite. Clara lowered the brush. "What happened to him?" The Duke's face closed like a door. "That is not a question for you." She accepted the rebuke without lowering her eyes. "No, Your Grace." A lesser man might have mistaken her calm for obedience. Alexander was not sure what to call it. Pride, perhaps, or dignity, the kind that did not need permission to exist. Midnight shifted, bringing his head near Clara's shoulder. She lifted her hand, and the horse settled again. The gesture was so simple that it hurt to watch. 5 years of grooms, trainers, experts, and orders had not earned what Clara received with patience and a quiet voice. "He returned alone," Alexander said before he could stop himself. Clara did not move. "Thomas went riding before a storm. He was told not to." Midnight came back before dawn without him. His gloved hand tightened around the stall rail. "After that, the horse would allow no one near him. I should have sold him." But you did not. No, why? The Duke looked at her then, and for a moment his gray eyes were not cold. They were tired. Because hatred can become a form of keeping something. Clara's expression softened. She understood that more than he could know. After her father's accident at the livery in Vermont, people had spoken of blame more eagerly than grief. They had needed a villain because sorrow without a target made them uncomfortable. Her father's name had been stained, and Clara had carried that stain from town to town, bright smile in place, back straight, heart guarded. Sometimes, she said, what we blame is only what survived. Alexander stared at her. The words entered the stable quietly, yet they seemed to disturb every shadow. Midnight breathed out, warm and low, and lowered his head again, not fully, but enough to rest near Clara's sleeve. She laughed under her breath, a small, musical sound that surprised even herself. You see, she whispered to the horse. You are not as impossible as they say. The sound of her laugh moved through Alexander like light beneath a closed door. He looked away at once, unsettled by it. The stable smelled of hay, leather, wood smoke, and winter. Nothing dangerous, nothing grand. Yet standing there, watching a beautiful stable girl speak kindness to the creature he had turned into a symbol of pain, Alexander felt the first uneasy suspicion that Whitmore Hall had not been haunted by midnight all these years. Perhaps it had been haunted by him. Morning came to Whitmore Hall with a pale sun hidden behind a ceiling of snow clouds, turning the estate into a world of silver roofs, black trees, and breath-white silence. Clara rose before the kitchen fires were fully awake, wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, and crossed the frozen yard with a quickness that belonged more to hope than duty. She had always moved that way, lightly, as if some private music followed her even into cold places. Yet when she reached Midnight's stall, that brightness softened into reverence. The black stallion was waiting near the door, his ears lifting at the sound of her steps. Well, she whispered, smiling as she slid the bolt free. You are either glad to see me, or you have decided I carry apples. From her pocket, she produced a small red apple taken from the breakfast stores with Mrs. Ellery's reluctant permission. Midnight sniffed it with solemn suspicion before accepting it from her palm. A duke's horse with the manners of a judge, Clara said. I shall have to behave myself. Behind her, someone gave a quiet cough. Clara turned so quickly that one curl slipped loose against her cheek. Duke Alexander stood in the aisle, already dressed for the day in a dark riding coat, his gloves tucked beneath one arm. He looked as though he had been there long enough to hear everything. Does he often receive commentary with his breakfast? He asked. Clara felt warmth rise to her face, but her eyes sparked with the lively humor she could not always hide. Only when he looks too proud, Your Grace. Midnight breathed heavily through his nose, as if agreeing. To Clara's surprise, the corner of Alexander's mouth moved, not enough to become a smile, but enough to make him seem briefly younger. The moment passed almost before it began. Walk him in the east paddock, he said. No saddle, no crowd. I want to see whether yesterday was chance. Clara nodded. It was not chance. Then prove it. The words were cool, but not unkind. Outside, the east paddock lay beneath 3 inches of snow, bordered by black fencing and skeletal maple trees. Clara led Midnight through the gate with a loose rope, never pulling, never demanding. Alexander watched from the rail, and beyond him, half hidden near the stable arch, Mr. Pierce lingered with a sour expression. Lady Victoria had not come to the yard, but Clara felt her absence like a closed fan waiting to snap open. The estate had eyes everywhere. Clara stepped into the paddock and let Midnight feel the space. The stallion lifted his head toward the wind, mane moving like dark water. Easy, Clara said. No one is chasing you. Alexander heard those words and looked away. They found places in him he had not offered them. Midnight took one step, then another. Clara walked beside him in the snow, her brown skirt brushing the white ground, her cheeks bright with cold. She looked beautiful there, not delicate like the painted ladies in the Whitmore Gallery, but vividly alive, a flame carried carefully through winter. After several minutes, a sharp clatter sounded from the stable arch. A metal pail rolled across the stones, struck the fence, and rang out. Midnight startled, pulling sideways. Mr. Pierce cursed under his breath and stepped back as if the accident had not been his. Alexander straightened. Clara did not tighten the rope. She moved with the horse, not against him, her boots sliding in the snow but her voice steady. "I know," she whispered. "I heard it too. But it is gone now. Listen to me instead." Midnight trembled, his dark eye wild for one breath. 2. 3. Clara lifted both hands slowly, showing him emptiness. "There is nothing in my hands," she said. "Nothing to hurt you." Alexander's face changed. Not visibly enough for Pierce to understand, but enough for Clara to feel the air shift. Those words did not belong only to the horse. They seemed to cross the paddock and stand before the Duke himself. Midnight lowered his head by degrees, fighting memory, then choosing her voice over his fear. Clara smiled, relieved, and reached up to touch his neck. At that instant, the stallion moved unexpectedly, not in anger, but in panic, and the edge of the rope burned across Clara's palm. She caught her breath and hid the hand against her skirt at once. "Enough," Alexander said, opening the gate. Clara turned. "He did very well. Your hand. It is nothing, Miss Bennet." His voice left no room for politeness. She showed him the reddened line across her palm. It was minor, but the sight of it altered him. He removed one glove, took her wrist with careful restraint, and studied the mark as if it were an accusation against the whole estate. Clara became very still. No gentleman had ever held her hand as though her pain mattered. "You should have said something," he said. "Servants learn not to mention small hurts." His eyes lifted to hers. Snow drifted between them, quiet as breath. "Do not bow to me when you are bleeding." Clara's lively courage faltered, not from fear, but from the unbearable gentleness of being seen. For a moment, the paddock, the horse, the watching groom, the entire frozen world seemed to disappear into the space between his hand and hers. Then Midnight stepped closer and lowered his head beside Clara's shoulder, placing himself between her and the wind. Alexander released her wrist slowly. He looked at the horse, then at the girl, and understood with a pain almost too quiet to bear that neither of them had been tamed. They had only been trusted. By the end of that week, the rhythm of Whitmore Hall had begun to change in ways no one wished to name. The servants still moved quietly through the long corridors. The silver was still polished until it reflected the candlelight, and the portraits of dead Whitmores still watched from the paneled walls with their cold ancestral eyes. Yet every morning, before the breakfast bell, a clear young voice could be heard from the east paddock, speaking to the most feared horse in the county as though he were an old friend with poor manners. Clara Bennet brought warmth into the stable without meaning to. She laughed when Midnight searched her pockets for apples. She scolded him when he nudged her shoulder too hard. She sang softly while brushing the snow from his mane, simple country tunes from Vermont, the kind that made kitchen maids pause near the doorway and smile before remembering themselves. She was beautiful in those unguarded moments, not with the distant perfection of drawing rooms, but with a bright, quick loveliness that made the cold seem less certain of itself. Alexander found reasons to pass the stables more often than any duke should. He told himself he was observing Midnight's progress. He told himself the horse remained a valuable and unpredictable piece of property. He told himself many things, because a man could survive for years on discipline if he never allowed truth to speak too loudly. Still, he began to notice details that had nothing to do with the horse. The way Clara tucked a curl behind her ear when concentrating, the way she hid worry beneath cheerfulness, the way her smile faded whenever letters arrived from town. One afternoon, after a clean snow had covered the estate in white, Alexander saw her standing alone near the tack room with a folded envelope in her hand. Her face, usually alive with motion, had gone still. "Bad news?" he asked from the doorway. Clara startled and tucked the letter into her apron pocket. "Only ordinary news, Your Grace." Ordinary news does not make a person look as though winter has entered the room. She gave a small smile, but it did not reach her eyes. "My brother Samuel is unwell. The boarding house keeper is impatient. That is all." "How old is he?" 14. Her voice softened at once. "Too proud to admit he is frightened and too clever to rest when told. He writes that he is improving, which means he is not." Alexander looked toward the frosted window. He had forgotten, or perhaps forced himself to forget, how young 14 was. Thomas had been 22 when the storm took him, but in memory grief made everyone younger. "You support him alone?" "Yes." Clara lifted her chin, not defensively, but with the dignity of someone who had learned to carry heavy things without display. Our father trained horses. After he died, work became less generous. Alexander heard the pause. He heard the door she did not open. Was he respected? Clara's lively eyes dimmed. Until people needed someone to blame. The words settled between them with uncomfortable familiarity. Midnight shifted in his stall, as if the air itself had tightened. Clara turned toward him at once, grateful for the interruption. I should finish the tack, she said. Alexander did not stop her, though something in him followed. Later, while searching for a softer training bridle among the old equipment, Clara found a saddle pushed behind a stack of cracked leather trunks in the rear of the tack room. Dust lay over it in a thick gray veil, but the craftsmanship was too fine to belong to any common groom. The leather was dark and stiff with age, the silverwork tarnished but expensive. Clara ran her fingers along the seam beneath the flap and paused. A section had been repaired clumsily, as if someone had tried to hide something in haste. She should have called Mr. Pierce. She should have left it alone. Instead, she loosened the brittle thread with the small knife she used for cutting twine. From beneath the lining slipped a narrow scrap of blue silk, faded but unmistakably elegant. Clara held it close to the lantern. In one corner, stitched in silver, was a falcon crest. She had seen that crest before, pressed into Lady Victoria Ashford's stationery, engraved on her carriage door, gleaming from the signet at her pale wrist. Clara's breath caught. The tack room seemed suddenly colder. If this saddle had been connected to Thomas Whitmore, then the story everyone believed might not be whole. Behind her, the door opened. Clara turned sharply, the blue silk hidden in her palm. Lady Victoria stood in the threshold, wrapped in white fur, her expression smooth as frozen cream. How industrious you are, she said. Digging through dead men's things now. Clara closed her fingers around the scrap. I was looking for a bridle. Victoria stepped inside, her perfume cutting through the smell of leather and hay. Her eyes dropped to Clara's clenched hand. Careful, Miss Bennet. Girls in your position often mistake discovery for power. Clara's heart beat hard, but her voice remained steady. And ladies in yours often mistake silence for innocence. For the first time, Victoria's perfect face changed. Only slightly. Only enough. Then she smiled. You are very pretty when you forget your place. She moved closer, lowering her voice. But your brother is in a boarding house that survives on the goodwill of my family's banker. It would be unfortunate if that goodwill vanished before the next snowfall. Clara felt the threat strike where pride could not shield her. Samuel coughing in a narrow bed. Samuel pretending not to be cold. Samuel waiting for the money she had not yet earned. Victoria turned toward the door, satisfied. Burn whatever you think you found. The Duke has buried enough ghosts. Clara stood motionless long after the lady left. In her hand, the blue silk trembled like a captured piece of winter sky. In the stall beyond the wall, Midnight gave a low, restless sound. Clara looked toward him, then toward the dark house where Alexander Whitmore lived among lies polished to a noble shine, and for the first time since she had arrived, her bright courage felt terribly alone. The days before the Christmas hunt settled over Whitmore Hall like frost over glass, beautiful from a distance and bitter to the touch. Guests began arriving in polished carriages, their trunks carried inside by footmen with red hands and lowered eyes. The great house awakened unwillingly beneath the pressure of society. Fires blazed in rooms long kept cold, chandeliers were lowered and cleaned, and the dining hall shone with silver, crystal, and winter greenery. Yet Clara Bennet moved through it all as though walking along the edge of a secret too sharp to hold. In her pocket, folded inside a handkerchief, lay the blue silk, bearing the Ashford falcon. She had not burned it. She had not shown it. Each choice felt like betrayal. If she spoke, Samuel might lose the shelter keeping him alive through the cold season. If she stayed silent, Alexander Whitmore would continue grieving a lie. The thought followed Clara into the stable at dawn, into the paddock at noon, into the lantern-lit quiet each night when Midnight lowered his head against her shoulder as if asking why her voice had changed. I am all right, she told him, though her smile had become thinner. You must not look at me that way. You will make me honest. Midnight breathed softly against her sleeve. Behind them, Alexander stood unseen near the open stable door, one hand resting on the frame. He had meant only to ask about the horse's progress before the hunt. Instead, he found himself watching Clara press her forehead briefly against Midnight's dark neck, her bright spirit dimmed by some burden she refused to name. It angered him that he noticed. It angered him more that he cared. "Miss Bennet," he said. Clara turned at once, too quickly. The movement told him what her words would not. "Your Grace, you have been avoiding me. I would not presume to avoid you. That is a careful answer." She gave a small smile. Careful answers are useful for people with little power. Alexander stepped inside. The stable lanterns caught the severe lines of his face, but his eyes were not severe tonight. They were searching. "Has someone made you afraid?" Clara's fingers tightened around the brush in her hand. She thought of Victoria's pale smile, the boarding house ledger, Samuel's proud little letters, and the silk hidden in her pocket. "No." Midnight shifted sharply, as though disagreeing. Clara glanced at him with a flash of helpless affection. "Traitor," she whispered. The word was so soft, so alive, that Alexander almost smiled. Almost. Then his gaze fell to the handkerchief at the edge of her apron pocket, where a hint of blue showed before she tucked it away. "What is that?" Clara's heart seemed to stop. "Nothing of importance." "You are a poor liar, Miss Bennet." "Then it is fortunate I do not practice often." For a long moment, they faced each other in the amber hush of the stable, with snow pressing against the windows and Midnight standing between them like a guardian of things unsaid. Alexander could have ordered her to show him. He was the Duke. The house, the horses, the land, the wages that fed her brother, all of it rested beneath his name. Clara seemed to know it too. She stood very still, waiting for power to do what power always did. Instead, Alexander took one step back. "When you are ready," he said, "bring it to me yourself." Clara looked at him then, truly looked, and the kindness of restraint nearly undid her. "Your Grace, I have spent years demanding answers from the dead," he said quietly. "I will not force them from the living." He left before she could reply. That night, the house filled with music for the arriving guests. Clara carried clean linens through the servants' corridor, while laughter drifted from the drawing room like warmth from a world she was not meant to enter. At the turn near the back staircase, she heard Lady Victoria's voice, low and smooth. "Tomorrow will settle everything." The girl has grown too visible. Mr. Pierce answered, uneasy but obedient. "And the stallion?" "Frightened animals are useful. So are frightened servants." Clara froze, her basket pressed against her ribs. No further words were needed. The hunt was not meant to display Midnight's progress. It was meant to ruin her. She stepped backward, but the floor gave a small, betraying creak. The voices stopped. Clara turned and hurried down the corridor, her pulse racing, her curls slipping loose around her face. She did not run to the Duke. She could not. Victoria's threat still held Samuel in its cold hand. Instead, she went to Midnight. The stable was dark except for one lantern. The stallion lifted his head the moment she entered, alert to the fear she could no longer hide. Clara slipped into his stall and wrapped her arms around his neck, not as a handler, not as a servant, but as a girl who had carried courage all day and finally needed something warm to hold. "Tomorrow," she whispered, "they may try to make you look wicked again." Midnight stood still beneath her. Trembling voice. "But we know better, do we not?" Outside, beneath the stable eaves, Alexander had followed at a distance after seeing her flee the corridor. He did not hear every word, but he heard enough. He saw enough. Clara Bennet, beautiful, brave, and trapped by a fear not meant for herself, clinging to the horse everyone else had condemned. In that moment, the Duke's grief became something colder and clearer than sorrow. Suspicion. And for the first time in 5 years, Alexander Whitmore wondered whether the truth about his brother had not been buried by tragedy, but by hands that still moved freely through his house. The morning of the Christmas hunt arrived beneath a hard white sky, with Whitmore Hall shining like a manor carved from ice. Carriages lined the long drive, horses stamped in the snow, and ladies in velvet cloaks gathered near the riding court, while gentlemen spoke in bright, careless voices meant to prove they feared neither cold nor scandal. Clara Bennet stood at Midnight's side near the stable arch, one gloved hand resting against his neck, her other hand hidden inside her apron pocket where the blue silk lay folded against her palm. She had slept little. Her cheeks were pale from worry, though her eyes still held that lively spark which hardship had never quite managed to extinguish. Midnight sensed everything. He turned his head whenever her breath changed, as if her heart had become a sound only he could hear. Across the court, Duke Alexander Whitmore greeted his guests with formal grace, but his gaze kept returning to Clara. He saw the careful way she avoided Lady Victoria. He saw Mr. Pierce watching the stallion too closely. He saw fear moving under the morning's polished surface like dark water beneath thin ice. "Miss Bennet," he said when he reached her. "Stay near midnight until I give other instructions." Clara curtsied. "Yes, Your Grace." There was more she wanted to say. It trembled behind her lips. The truth, the silk, the threat against Samuel. But Lady Victoria appeared beside them in a white riding habit trimmed with silver, lovely and cold as fresh snow. "How charming," she said. The Duke's newest wonder in her. Black Shadow. One might almost think this estate has taken to fairy tales. Clara kept her head high. "Some fairy tales are only warnings dressed prettily, my lady." Victoria's smile did not reach her eyes. "Then let us hope everyone remembers their proper ending." Before Clara could answer, a sharp commotion rose from the tack room. A young groom stumbled out carrying the old saddle Clara had discovered days before. The faded leather hung over his arms, and beneath it, caught where all could see, was the blue Ashford silk, no longer hidden in Clara's pocket, but pinned crudely beneath the torn flap as if recently placed there. Mr. Pierce stepped forward at once. "Your Grace, I found Miss Bennet near this room before dawn. She had no business with this saddle." Clara's breath caught. Her hand flew to her pocket. Empty. The silk was gone. Lady Victoria covered her mouth with delicate surprise, but her eyes were bright. The guests turned. Their whispers came quickly, hungry as winter birds. A servant stealing from the family tack? Was she trying to damage the hunt? After all the Duke did for her? Alexander looked at Clara, not with accusation. Not yet. But the pause was enough to wound. Clara felt it like cold water through cloth. She had endured laughter, dismissal, and insult, but his silence reached a softer place, the place that had begun foolishly to trust him. "I did not place it there," she said. Her voice was steady, though color had drained from her face. "Then how do you know what it is?" Victoria asked gently, too gently. The court sharpened around the question. Clara's fingers curled. She could expose the threat. She could name Victoria. She could pull Samuel into danger before 100 elegant witnesses who would enjoy the drama and forget the boy by supper. Her silence returned, not from guilt, but from love. Mr. Pierce bowed toward the Duke. "Your Grace, if I may speak plainly, the girl has been overpraised. Servants who rise too quickly often imagine themselves untouchable." Midnight's ears pinned back. Clara placed a calming hand on his neck. "Easy," she whispered, though her own heart was breaking. Victoria took one step closer, her perfume sweet over the smell of snow and horses. Perhaps she hoped to make the animal fail, then appear to save him again. A clever little performance. The words struck the crowd exactly where they wished to be struck. Suspicion became certainty. Gratitude became contempt. Clara stood in the center of it, beautiful even in humiliation, her brown cloak plain among silk and fur, her curls loosened by the wind, her chin lifted with a dignity no accusation could fully bend. Alexander remained still. Inside him, grief and memory collided. He saw Thomas's saddle, the Ashford crest, Clara's frightened eyes, Victoria's perfect calm, Pierce's eagerness. Every fact stood before him, but none yet formed a shape he could trust. "Remove her from the court," Victoria said softly. "Surely the hunt cannot proceed under such unpleasantness." A footman moved uncertainly toward Clara. Midnight stepped between them, not violently, not wildly, simply with the immovable authority of a creature who had chosen. His black body shielded Clara from the reaching hand, and the court fell silent once more. Clara closed her eyes for one brief second, overwhelmed by the loyalty she had not asked for and did not know how to deserve. "Midnight," she whispered, touching his mane. "Please." The stallion lowered his head, but did not move away. Alexander saw it then, not proof for society, but proof for the soul. The horse everyone called impossible trusted Clara when every human voice had turned against her. Still, the trap held. The guests were watching. Victoria was waiting. Samuel remained vulnerable somewhere in town. Clara opened her eyes and looked at the Duke. No plea, no tears, only a quiet pain that asked whether he would be another person who found it easier to doubt her than to stand beside her. Alexander took one step forward, but before he could speak, Mr. Pierce seized the old saddle and lifted it high for the crowd. As he did, a small object slipped from a hidden tear in the lining and struck the stone at his feet with a clear, delicate ring. The sound traveled through the frozen court. Alexander looked down. The object gleamed against the pale stone, silver darkened by age. Engraved with two small letters he had not seen in 5 years. T.W. Thomas Whitmore's signet ring. The ring lay on the pale stone as if it had fallen from the hand of the past itself. For one suspended breath, no one moved. The horses quieted. The guests forgot to whisper. Even the winter wind seemed to hold itself against the glass roof of the court. Duke Alexander Whitmore stared down at the silver signet, and the world he had built from certainty began to crack without making a sound. Thomas's ring had been buried with no body to wear it, or so he had been told. It had been listed among the belongings lost to the storm, another small mercy stolen by weather and grief. Yet there it was, marked with the initials of his brother, hidden inside an old saddle tied to an Ashford crest and dragged into daylight by the very people accusing Clara Bennet. Mr. Pierce lowered the saddle slowly, his face losing color. Lady Victoria's hand tightened around the handle of her riding crop, though her smile remained with the bravery of polished glass. "How extraordinary," she said. "It seems the girl's meddling has uncovered some old family trinket." Alexander bent and picked up the ring. He did not look at Victoria. He did not look at Pierce. He looked at the worn silver until memory rose, clear and merciless. Thomas laughing in the south field. Thomas spinning the ring on his thumb during dull dinners. Thomas telling Alexander that midnight was not dangerous, only proud. Clara stood behind the stallion, one hand resting on Midnight's neck, her face pale but steady. She understood before the Duke spoke that the ring had done what she could not. It had given the truth permission to breathe. "This was my brother's," Alexander said. His voice was quiet, but it carried through the court with more force than any shout. "It has been missing for 5 years." Lady Victoria lifted her chin. Then surely Miss Bennet must explain why it appeared only after she began searching through things that did not belong to her. Midnight moved, placing himself more fully before Clara. Alexander saw the motion and, for the first time, did not see an animal's defiance. He saw testimony. "No," he said. The single word silenced her. Victoria blinked. "Your Grace, you will be silent until I ask you to speak." The color in her cheeks sharpened. Around them, the guests exchanged startled glances. Alexander turned to Mr. Pierce. "Who brought this saddle from storage?" Pierce swallowed. "I found it, Your Grace." "That was not my question. I was told to bring it." "By whom?" The head groom's eyes darted toward Victoria and then away. That glance was enough to change the weather in the room. Alexander's hand closed around the ring. "By whom, Pierce?" The man's shoulders sagged. "Lady Victoria asked me to place it where it would be discovered. She said it would prove the girl had been prying. She said no harm would come of it." Victoria laughed once, brittle and bright. "A servant frightened of dismissal will say anything." Clara stepped forward then, no longer shielded completely by Midnight, though the stallion stayed close. Her voice was gentle, but it did not tremble. There was blue silk hidden beneath the saddle flap. The Ashford crest was stitched into it. "I found it days ago." Victoria turned on her. "And kept it secret like a thief." "I kept it secret because you threatened my brother." A murmur passed through the court, but Clara did not look away. "Samuel Bennet is 14 years old, ill, and staying in a boarding house connected to your family's banker. You told me the goodwill keeping him there could vanish before the next snowfall." Alexander's face became still in a way that made the air colder. "Is this true?" Victoria's lips parted, but no graceful answer came quickly enough. The silence condemned her more cleanly than any confession. From the edge of the crowd, an elderly guest, Colonel Ames, stepped forward, leaning on his cane. "Whitmore," he said gravely, "I remember the night your brother vanished. There were whispers that young Thomas had been seen arguing with Lord Ashford near the lower road. No one wished to accuse a family so close to yours. We all called it grief and weather, because that was easier." Victoria's composure splintered. "My father protected this house from scandal. Thomas was reckless. He would have ruined reputations over a childish quarrel." Alexander looked at her then, and Clara saw 5 years of sorrow leave his face only to reveal something deeper beneath it. Not rage, but grief finally given a name. My brother was not a scandal to be managed. Victoria stepped back. Pierce bowed his head. The guest stood frozen in the terrible elegance of exposed truth. Alexander turned away from them and walked to Clara. She looked up at him, still beautiful, still bright beneath the hurt, though humiliation had left its shadow across her face. For a moment, he seemed unable to speak. Then he removed his glove and held out Thomas's ring, not as evidence, but as apology. "You saw the truth when I only saw pain," he said. Clara's eyes glistened, but she did not weep. Midnight saw it first. At the sound of his name, the black stallion lowered his head between them, calm beneath the watching crowd. Alexander rested his hand briefly against Midnight's mane, and the horse did not pull away. The court drew in a soft collective breath. It was not the horse that had been untamable, Clara thought. It was the grief everyone had mistaken for strength. Alexander turned to the gathered guests, his voice clear, controlled, and final. "Miss Bennet is under my protection. Any insult made against her from this moment will be treated as an insult against me." Clara felt the words settle around her, not like a chain, but like shelter. Lady Victoria looked as though the snow itself had entered her veins. Yet Clara did not feel triumph. Only the weary relief of someone who had carried a candle through a storm and found, at last, that someone else had seen the flame. By evening, the Christmas hunt had been forgotten. The guests departed Whitmore Hall in uneasy silence, carrying with them a story far different from the one they had expected to enjoy. Lady Victoria left before sunset, her white cloak drawn close around her as though elegance could still protect her from disgrace. Mr. Pierce was dismissed without spectacle, his keys surrendered on the stable steps, and letters were sent to secure Samuel Bennet's room, doctor, and winter care before Clara even knew the Duke had given the order. Snow continued to fall, but inside the great house, something long frozen had begun to thaw. Clara did not attend the supper arranged for the remaining guests. She could not bear another room full of eyes, even kind ones. Instead, she went to the stable, where lantern light glowed softly over wood, brass, and clean straw. Midnight stood waiting, calm now in a way that seemed almost sorrowful, as if the truth had lightened him and aged him all at once. Clara entered his stall and rested her hand against his neck. "You were very brave today," she whispered. The stallion lowered his head until his dark forelock brushed her sleeve. "Braver than I was." A voice answered from the aisle. "That is not true." Clara turned. Duke Alexander stood beyond the open stall door, no cane in his hand, no formal distance in his posture. He looked tired, deeply and honestly tired, but the severity that had once made his face seem carved from winter had softened into something human. He stepped closer, then stopped, as though permission mattered here in a way it had not mattered in his own halls for years. "May I come in?" Clara's heart moved strangely at the question. "Yes, Your Grace." He entered slowly. Midnight watched him, but did not retreat. Alexander looked at the horse first, then at Clara. "I owe you more than an apology. You owe me nothing. Do not be generous merely because you have learned to survive without being given what you deserved." The words touched the quietest part of her. Clara looked down at her hands, reddened from cold and work, hands that had held reins, medicine coins, old letters, and other people's grief. "I should leave," she said softly. Alexander became very still. "Why?" "Because tomorrow the house will remember I am still only Clara Bennet, a girl from Vermont, a stable hand with one good dress and a brother depending on her. Today people pitied me. Tomorrow they will resent me. Let them." She smiled faintly, though sadness trembled at the edge of it. "That is easy to say when you are the Duke." The truth of it struck him cleanly. He looked away toward Midnight, who stood between them like a dark witness to all that remained unspoken. For 5 years, Alexander had thought command was the same as strength. He had believed protection meant walls, locked gates, cold rules, and silence. Yet Clara had protected a frightened horse without owning him, defended a dead man without knowing him, and preserved her own dignity in rooms designed to strip it away. She had done with kindness what his power had failed to do with years. Alexander removed his gloves and set them on the straw-covered floor between them, a gesture so small that Clara did not understand it at first. Then, slowly, impossibly, the Duke of Whitmore bowed his head. Not the polished bow of a nobleman greeting society. Not courtesy. Not performance. Humility. Clara's breath caught. Your Grace, please do not. Alexander, he said quietly. She froze. He lifted his eyes to hers. If you leave, let it not be because this house was too proud to ask you to stay properly. The lantern flame trembled against the wooden walls. Midnight exhaled, warm and low. Alexander's voice lowered, not with command, but with the bare honesty of a man laying down armor piece by piece. Stay? Not as my servant. Not as my obligation. Stay because you brought mercy into a place that had mistaken grief for nobility. Stay because my brother's name is lighter tonight. Stay because that horse trusts you, because my house needs you, and because He stopped, as though the final truth stood too near the edge of his control. Clara did not press him. She had never needed loud declarations. She understood wounded things by what they could not say. Because you do not wish me to go? She asked. The question was gentle, almost bright, carrying the girl she had been before fear had quieted her. For the first time since she had known him, Alexander smiled. It was faint, imperfect, and beautiful because it cost him something. Because I do not wish you to go. Clara looked at Midnight. The stallion, solemn as a judge and tender as a secret, lowered his head beside the Duke's. A soft laugh escaped her then, warm enough to make the stable seem less like shelter and more like home. She reached out, placing one hand against Midnight's mane and the other, after one brave breath, into Alexander's open palm. He held it with careful respect, as though trust were something sacred and easily bruised. Outside, snow covered the old tracks in the yard, softening every mark left by fear, pride, and sorrow. Inside the stable, beneath lantern light and the quiet breath of the black stallion, Clara Bennett remained standing, not above the Duke, not below him, but beside him. Some hearts do not need to be conquered. They only need one gentle soul to stand near long enough for them to remember how to bow.